Utah, 1867. The snow was falling so hard it buried the tracks faster than men could lay them. Thousands labored in silence, their faces hollow, their stomachs empty. These were the men promised wages, food, and a future. Instead, they were led into a wilderness where hope froze in the air and death became as common as breath. At first, their disappearances were explained away. A collapse from exhaustion. A man wandering too far into the storm. The overseers spoke little, and when the stew was ladled out at night, the men pretended not to notice how strange the meat tasted. But silence cannot hold forever. Soon, rumors began to coil around the camps like smoke. The missing weren't vanishing into the blizzards. They were being turned into something else. They never meant for you to hear this. They never meant for anyone to know. Comment the phrase, "I see the hidden," twice below, to seal your place among those who awaken. Subscribe, and tell me where in the world you're watching from, because the shadows I'm about to reveal stretch into every corner of the earth. The barrels of supplies bore no marks, no seals of origin. The meat inside cooked too fast, as if overseers were desperate to boil away its identity, and the workers knew, with every mouthful, that what filled their bowls was not shipped from any city. It was carved from the very men who had dropped beside them hours before. This was not an accident of hunger. It was not survival cannibalism. It was engineered. Overseers calculated rations with death in mind, turning flesh into fuel and silence into obedience. The company needed track laid, not men saved. Every bite of stew ensured another day of labor, another mile of progress. And so the railroad advanced, mile by mile, corpse by corpse. You were taught the railroads built America. But what you were not taught is that America's great unifier was fed by America's own children. The steel was laid with bones, the engines fired with silence, and the tracks were soaked in the taste of men devouring men. They called it progress. The newspapers back east spoke of triumph, of steel connecting oceans, of men conquering the wilderness. They never printed what those men endured to make it real. They never told of the silence that swallowed the camps at night, when the snow muffled the screams and the overseers kept the fires burning low to hide the smell. The workers were caught in a trap. Hunger gnawed them from within, but so did the knowledge of what was in their bowls. Some refused to eat, clinging to their last scraps of dignity. They were the next to vanish. Others forced themselves to chew, swallowing shame along with flesh, convincing themselves it was beef, pork, anything but the truth. Yet deep down, they knew. Each bite dragged them further into complicity, into a pact sealed by silence. And the silence was the overseer's weapon. Men too terrified to speak, too weak to resist, too broken to rebel. What better way to ensure obedience than to make the workers question their own humanity? If you can make a man eat his brother, you can make him do anything. The railroad's masters understood this. They had studied men as much as steel. They knew starvation strips away identity, and hunger bends the will. They calculated not only miles of track, but how many corpses it would take to fuel those miles. They reduced human life to units of consumption, flesh for progress, silence for order. The Chinese laborers whispered of spirits restless in the snow, ghosts of men betrayed by their own companions. The Irish muttered prayers over their bowls, crossing themselves with trembling hands before forcing another spoonful past their lips. Every culture brought its rituals, but none of them could purify what they were consuming. And yet the rails advanced. Every day another body fell. Every night another pot boiled, and with each mile gained, the men were pulled further into a nightmare they could never escape. They had become both the builders and the sacrifice. History tells you the railroad united a nation, but the truth buried beneath the snow is that it devoured one first. It fed not only on men's bodies, but on their silence, their faith, and their very sense of self. The bodies were not wasted. That was the rule. Nothing left behind, nothing allowed to remind the men of who had fallen. Flesh was stripped, bones buried shallow, clothes burned before dawn. The overseers orchestrated it with precision, as if they had done it before, as if this was not an accident of circumstance, but a system rehearsed and perfected. Those who resisted became examples. A man who refused to eat was starved until his mind cracked, then fed to the fire, his flesh served up to the very companions who had listened to him pray. A man who spoke too loudly about what he suspected disappeared into the snow, only for his boots to reappear the next morning. Empty, nailed to the post of the cookhouse like a warning. Every act of defiance was answered not just with death, but with a spectacle, a ritual designed to remind the living that silence was survival. And yet silence was its own kind of death. Workers no longer spoke of home, or families, or futures. They spoke only in whispers about rations, about the taste of meat, about how many had fallen that week. They no longer measured time by days, but by how many bodies were missing when the sun rose. Imagine the psychology of it. Men waking each morning beside companions who might be stew by nightfall. Every cough, every stumble, every moment of weakness became a death sentence, and so men worked faster, harder, beyond endurance, driven not by wages or loyalty, but by the primal fear of becoming the next meal. The overseers did not need chains. Hunger was the shackle, silence the whip. History records these men as nameless laborers. But namelessness was part of the design. By erasing their stories, the railroad erased the crime. You were told about golden spikes, about champagne toasts, about triumph. What you were not told is that beneath those ceremonies lay miles of track paved in secrecy, silence, and human flesh. And here lies the most chilling truth. Once you feed men their own, you strip away not only their dignity, but their capacity to rebel. You break the human spirit itself. And that is what the railroad bought, not just miles of steel, but obedience purchased with cannibalism. The wind carried more than cold that winter. It carried whispers. Some said spirits walked alongside the living, shadows of men who had been eaten, guiding the hands of those who still survived. Others swore the snow itself soaked up guilt, pressing it into the skin until no man could hide it. Fear had become as physical as hunger, as inescapable as the rails stretching endlessly into the frozen horizon. Comment the phrase, "I see the hidden," twice below, to seal your place among those who awaken. Those who typed it, who whispered it themselves, were stepping into a circle of knowledge they were never meant to enter. Because what I am about to reveal next was hidden in plain sight. The companies didn't just exploit labor. They created a system where hunger became obedience, where death became currency. Every missing man was a calculation, every pot of stew a ledger entry, and the men who ate, forced to swallow not just meat but complicity, carried the weight of guilt that no one else could see. This is how control works. You do not need to threaten the mind when you have already poisoned the body. As the frost deepened, hallucinations became common. Some men saw the faces of the devoured in the meat. Others dreamt of the rails turning into rivers of blood. The snow reddened with betrayal. And yet, dawn always came, bringing new orders, new miles to lay, new bodies to consume. The cycle had no mercy. The overseers spoke in soft tones, almost parental, almost comforting, guiding their workers as though they were shepherds and not devourers. Every instruction, every rationed bite, every threat of disappearance was calculated to reinforce a single lesson: obedience is survival. Resistance means becoming part of the next meal. These men, this army of labor, were trapped in a loop of fear, hunger, and enforced silence. The railroad's expansion was not a triumph of engineering. It was a triumph of psychological manipulation, of turning humans into instruments of their own destruction. Every mile gained, every spike driven, every track laid was a testament not to progress, but to the terrifying power of orchestrated fear. And so the history books lie, as they always do. They tell stories of conquest, unity, and nation building. They never tell you the truth that the rails of America were forged in flesh, and that men learned obedience through the horror of eating their own. They were no longer just laborers. By the third month of winter, the surviving men had become something else. Shadows of themselves, stripped of identity, of hope, of memory. They spoke in murmurs, exchanging stories not of home, not of survival, but of what had been served to them in the stew. Names were lost, faces blurred. Every man carried the invisible mark of complicity. The overseers, dressed in warmth and fine coats, walked among them like spirits, watching the transformation with clinical detachment. Each man's obedience was proof of control, each glance of fear, each tremor of guilt, a lesson in submission. Hunger had been the instrument. The consumption of the fallen had been the method. Together, they formed a system designed to erase humanity, while preserving labor. Some nights, the men dreamed of being eaten themselves, of seeing their own body carved into portions for someone else. They awoke in sweat, trembling, unable to tell dream from reality. Madness, it seemed, was part of the curriculum. A man broken enough to doubt himself could be directed anywhere. To lift a spike, to swing an axe, to bury another without thought. And the overseers counted every ounce of compliance, knowing that the mind can be enslaved only when the body is already a prisoner. They had no choice but to comply. Hunger and fear intertwined into a chain that bound the men tighter than iron. Every day they swallowed not just food but guilt, not just sustenance but terror. The smell of cooking flesh became the background music of their labor, familiar and unavoidable, a rhythm of silent submission. And yet, despite the horror, life clung stubbornly. Men continued to work, driven by the desperate hope of seeing another sunrise, another mile of track completed. But survival carried a cost, one that could never be repaid. Every mile laid meant a human life digested, every spike driven forced into the frozen earth another man's existence consumed. When historians later wrote of these railroads, they praised ingenuity, progress, and perseverance. They never recorded the psychological chains, the nightly feasts of horror, the slow erosion of men's humanity. You must understand, this was not a failure of logistics. This was not a consequence of nature. This was deliberate. Every act, every ration, every disappearance was calculated, orchestrated, and hidden behind the veil of progress. The truth is simple, terrifying, and forbidden. They did not just build railroads. They built obedience. They built fear. They built a system where men fed on men, and in doing so, learned to obey the forces that governed them, forces you were never meant to see. By now, the camps had become more than work sites, they were crucibles. Hunger had already bent men to obedience, but fear and secrecy were the true architects of control. Every missing man, every quiet death, was cataloged not in ledger books for profit, but in the unspoken hierarchy of power. The overseers were not merely supervisors. They were gatekeepers of a forbidden knowledge, enforcing rituals that ensured silence and compliance. The men who survived began noticing patterns. Certain names always vanished first, certain groups were fed first, and others last. It was not random. This was a curriculum in human hierarchy, a cruel education in submission. And the ones who refused to learn, they disappeared, leaving nothing behind except warnings carved into snow and whispered through trembling lips. Hunger was predictable. Obedience was the desired outcome, and the consumption of the fallen, that was the ultimate lesson. It taught more than fear. It taught complicity. A man who ate another man's flesh internalized the system. He became part of it, and in doing so, lost the ability to rebel. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred until both were one, indistinguishable, trapped in a ritual they never chose. The overseers whispered instructions like priests, guiding their followers in a dark liturgy disguised as survival. No one outside the camps would ever know. Letters sent to families were censored. Reports filed in distant offices claimed sickness, misadventure, accidents. The truth was erased with every mile of track laid over the frozen earth. The men, for their part, began to believe that silence was safety, that compliance was salvation, but they were being trained, conditioned. Every act of consumption, every glance at a missing companion, was a lesson etched into muscle and mind alike. Hunger and fear became instruments of absolute psychological control, and the railroad, the symbol of unity and progress, became the mechanism through which men were broken and reshaped. Understand this, the railroad was more than steel and timber. It was a machine of human manipulation, perfected in isolation and secrecy. The men who worked it were not only laborers, they were unwilling participants in a system designed to turn fear into power, flesh into obedience, and silence into mastery. And the world, when it read the history books, believed in progress. But you now know the hidden truth: progress was never innocent. It was a shadow, built upon the bodies of those who had been consumed. Physically, mentally, spiritually. They were never meant for you to hear this. By the time spring threatened the horizon, the men were no longer individuals. They had become instruments, extensions of a system designed to consume both body and mind. Hunger and fear had done their work, but now something darker had taken hold. The knowledge that obedience could save you, but only at the cost of your soul. Some began to suspect that the railroad's overseers were not mere men of business. They were initiates of a larger design, part of a hidden hierarchy that thrived on secrecy, manipulation, and the careful orchestration of terror. Letters vanished, witnesses disappeared, and every act of cruelty, every pot of meat, every silent mile of track laid in snow was part of a ritual no outsider could ever understand. The men whispered of codes in the supervisor's movements, subtle signs, gestures, even certain words that triggered compliance in the laborers. Hunger had taught them to obey. The missing bodies had taught them to fear. Now these signs reinforced a psychological trap that was nearly impossible to break. Obedience had become reflexive, second nature, embedded in muscle memory, in the way the men moved, ate, and even breathed. And yet there was resistance, small, almost imperceptible, but persistent. Men who refused to look away, who questioned the stew, who whispered prayers to the snow, or muttered the names of the fallen. They were punished quietly, disappearances leaving only fear as a reminder. Those who survived carried the memory as both warning and lesson. They became carriers of knowledge they were never meant to have. The system was self-reinforcing. Hunger forced compliance. Consumption forced complicity. Silence enforced obedience. And through all of it, the railroad advanced mile by mile, a monument not just to engineering, but to a horrifying mastery of human behavior. Those miles of track were not just steel laid upon earth. They were lines drawn through the moral consciousness of every man who had worked them, a testament to the lengths a system would go to survive and expand. History records progress, innovation, and unity. But you now know the hidden truth. It was built on rituals of horror, orchestrated control, and the consumption of men by men. The laborers were both victims and unwilling participants in a machine far greater than themselves. And these truths, these are not meant for the eyes or ears of the ordinary world. The snow had melted in patches, revealing the frozen earth beneath, the same earth that had swallowed secrets, cries, and bodies alike. But the men who survived were not free. Hunger had passed, but something darker had settled in their bones, the knowledge that every bite, every mile, every obedient act had bound them to a system they could never escape. Comment the phrase, "I see the hidden," twice below, to seal your place among those who awaken. Those who obeyed this small act stepped closer to understanding, yet also closer to the same darkness that had ensnared the workers of 1867. Because the knowledge itself carries weight, and weight can crush the unprepared. The overseers now required less coercion. Men had internalized fear. They moved automatically, hands swinging axes and shovels, eyes downcast, hearts racing not from labor, but from the terror of knowing what came after. The missing were no longer spoken of. Their presence lingered in the bowls of stew, in the silence of the camps, in the tremors of the men who understood that complicity had become a survival strategy. It was no longer simply about hunger. It was about obedience, psychology, and the careful orchestration of terror. Every order was a test, every ration a lesson. The men had been conditioned to fear, yes, but more than that, to accept that survival could only come through consumption, silence, and the erasure of morality. Those who resisted became ghosts themselves, quietly removed and never spoken of again, leaving only dread for the living. And here is the truth that history will never tell. The railroad's expansion was a theater of manipulation. Hunger was a tool, death a resource, and the men themselves were actors in a drama far beyond their comprehension. The overseers were not simply men, they were conductors of a dark symphony, orchestrating fear, obedience, and consumption with precision. The survivors carried the weight of participation, some in shame, some in numbness, all forever changed. The rails stretched farther, steel glinting in the sun, hiding the shadowed horrors beneath. Progress, history says. But the shadow beneath the steel is the true measure of what was accomplished. Obedience through horror, loyalty through terror, and survival at the expense of humanity itself. The world applauded progress, but few could perceive the cost. And you now know the secret they never meant for anyone to hear. By mid-spring, the survivors were hollowed not just in body, but in spirit. Hunger had passed, but fear and obedience lingered, etched into every gesture, every glance. The railroad's overseers were no longer mere supervisors. They had become arbiters of life and death, masters of a system designed to train men to obey without question. Every disappearance, every meal, every shadowed corner of the camp was orchestrated. There was no accident here. The men who vanished were not mistakes. They were necessary calculations in a far-reaching plan, and the men who remained were carefully molded. Their minds and instincts reshaped until they could no longer distinguish survival from complicity. The pattern extended beyond the camps. Orders came from distant offices, letters of inspection, and reports to investors, all meticulously sanitized. The executives never touched a shovel, never stirred a pot. Yet they controlled life and death with the stroke of a pen, ensuring that each act of horror was hidden from the world. They were engineers of obedience, exploiting hunger, fear, and secrecy to maintain power. The remaining workers began noticing signs, subtle rituals, coded signals in the overseer's movements, in how provisions were distributed, in who was singled out for disappearance. These were not random, they were lessons. Obey the rules, and you survive. Resist, and you vanish, and the consumption of the fallen. That was the final lesson, the one that bound men irrevocably to the system, ensuring that no act of rebellion could ever succeed. Some began to call it a liturgy. The frozen desert became a cathedral of fear, each disappearance a sacrament, each meal a communion of silence and complicity. Hunger, death, and obedience had fused into a ritual that could not be broken. Men were trained not only to work, but to internalize their oppression, to become willing participants in their own subjugation. The railroad moved forward, mile by mile, carrying the weight of lives consumed and lessons learned. Outside, history celebrated ingenuity. But hidden in snow, steel, and silence was a darker truth. The railroad was a system of control, a laboratory for the manipulation of men, and the men themselves were both subjects and instruments, bound together in a cycle of horror carefully concealed from the world. And so the shadow of 1867 stretches forward, a reminder that progress is often paid for in blood, and that some truths were never meant for anyone to see, until now. By late spring, the surviving men were no longer workers. They were shadows, vessels of fear and obedience, walking reminders of the system's power. Each morning, they rose not to labor, but to continue a ritual they could no longer name. The ritual of survival through compliance, of life purchased with silence and consumption. The overseers required less overt coercion now. The lessons had been internalized. Men obeyed automatically, moved automatically, and even thought automatically within the parameters the system had set. Hunger had been a teacher, consumption had been a sacrament, and fear had become instinct. Resistance had been eliminated, not by force, but by conditioning. Those who might have rebelled had long since disappeared, leaving only the obedient and the haunted. Even the simplest acts carried weight. A glance at a missing companion, a hesitation over a spoonful of stew, a faltering in the work line. All were monitored, all were recorded, all were punished subtly. Obedience had become a ritual of self-surveillance. Men were not merely controlled from the outside, they had internalized the overseer's authority, policing themselves through terror. It was in this silence that the railroad's true mechanism revealed itself. Each mile of track, each spike driven, each cabin built was both proof of progress and evidence of mastery over human behavior. The world outside saw steel stretching across the land. The men inside understood that their humanity had been consumed long before the rails were laid. History tells you that the railroads united a nation. It hides the fact that the men who made it possible were consumed in every sense. Physically, mentally, morally, they were instruments of a hidden order, victims and participants in a system designed to strip them of all agency. Hunger, fear, and the consumption of the fallen had created perfect obedience. And here is what no history book will tell you. The lessons learned in the Utah camps of 1867 did not end with the frozen winter. They were archived in silence, transmitted in rituals, repeated in subtle patterns of control, and hidden in plain sight. Progress, unity, civilization, these were the masks for a far darker truth. The railroad had advanced, the men survived, but they were not free. And neither is anyone who walks unknowing into a system designed to consume body, mind, and soul. By summer, the survivors had become almost unrecognizable. Their bodies bore the marks of hunger, exhaustion, and relentless labor, but it was their minds that carried the deepest scars. the mental imprint of a system designed to consume both flesh and will. They had internalized obedience so completely that fear was no longer needed. Compliance had become instinct. The overseers were gone from direct sight, replaced by ritual, routine, and the memory of terror. Men measured themselves by how much they could endure, by how carefully they avoided glances, how faithfully they followed invisible rules. The absence of punishment had not freed them, it had cemented control. They were prisoners within their own minds, conditioned to maintain the order that had destroyed so many. Some tried to resist in subtle ways: a refusal to speak, a delayed action, a whispered prayer in the night. Those attempts were always noticed. Silence, it turned out, was not only required, but policed by the very men who had survived. They had become enforcers of a system they had once been victimized by. Hunger and consumption had created a perfect cycle, men enforcing the horrors upon themselves and others, perpetuating obedience across every level of survival. Outside, the railroad expanded. Communities celebrated progress, trade flourished, and newspapers praised human ingenuity. But underneath the gleaming steel lay layers of unrecorded horror, the bones and memories of those who had been sacrificed to obedience. Every mile of track was a reminder of the invisible cost. Every structure a testament to the silent, complicit survivors who had carried out what no one else could see. And here is the cruelest truth: the men did survive, but they were never the same. Hunger, fear, and forced complicity had altered their perception of morality. They had learned to obey through horror, to normalize the unthinkable, to accept as inevitable what would destroy any ordinary conscience. History celebrates the railroad. History hides the truth. But you now know the expansion of steel, the progress of a nation, the triumph of civilization. All were built on a system of terror that turned men into instruments of their own consumption. The lessons of 1867 did not die with the snow. They linger, buried beneath the tracks, waiting to be seen by those who dare to look beyond the polished surface. And you were never meant to hear this. The railroad was complete. Steel stretched across deserts, mountains, and rivers, gleaming in the sunlight as though nothing dark had ever transpired beneath it. But the truth remained buried, not under snow, not under earth, but within the minds of the survivors. Every man who had lived carried the secret like a shadow, a constant reminder of how progress had been forged through terror and consumption. The system had perfected itself. Hunger, fear, and ritualized complicity had created a new order of obedience. Men had learned to survive not by strength or skill, but by surrendering morality, swallowing the unthinkable, and perpetuating the horrors upon each other. The lessons were etched in muscle memory, in instinct, in the silent echoes of every action taken. Those who recorded history wrote of triumph, expansion, and ingenuity. They never wrote of the meals taken in darkness, of the missing men, of the psychological chains that bound the living. And yet, these truths persist, hidden in plain sight in the shadows of progress, in the gaps between lines of official accounts. They wait for the eyes of those who are willing to see beyond the polished surface. The legacy of the Utah camps of 1867 is not just death or labor. It is a lesson in the power of systems of manipulation, of orchestrated horror. The men survived, but their humanity was fractured. They had become both victims and instruments, witnesses and participants, bound forever by knowledge they were never meant to possess. And you, listening now, are part of that circle. You have seen what was hidden, understood what was erased. You know that progress has a price far greater than history will ever admit, and that obedience can be manufactured through the most unthinkable means. You have glimpsed the machinery that consumes not only bodies but minds, and you have survived to carry the truth. Remember, this history is written by the victors, but horror leaves traces that cannot be erased. Beneath every mile of steel, beneath every story of triumph, lies the shadow of what they never meant for anyone to know. And now you know it. They never wanted you to hear this, but you have.